December 16, 1944, 05:30 a.m., the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A profound, frost-laden silence blankets the dense, snow-covered woodlands of the Ardennes, a deceptive peace along an 85-mile front that Allied commanders have dismissively dubbed the Ghost Front. Here, the colossal, grinding momentum of WWII in Western Europe seems to have stalled, settled into a static, weary line held by a mix of battered American veterans and untested replacements, all dreaming of a Christmas they hope will be quiet, a brief respite in the final act of the war. They are miserably cold, under-equipped for the severest winter in European memory, but sustained by a single, pervasive belief: the German Wehrmacht is broken, incapable of anything but a stubborn, defensive fight. This belief, in these first pale minutes of December 16th, is a catastrophic and deadly illusion. Concealed within the frozen pine forests east of the Our River, the last great strategic reserve of Nazi Germany has assembled in utter secrecy, a final, desperate gamble ordained by Adolf Hitler himself. This is not a local counterattack. It is Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, an apocalyptic offensive involving nearly 30 divisions, over 1,000 armored vehicles, and 1,900 artillery pieces. Its objectives are nothing short of delusional grandeur: to split the Allied armies in half, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a political crisis that could reverse the entire course of WWII. At precisely 05:30, under perfect cloud cover that neutralizes the Allies' supreme air power, the world explodes. A hurricane of German artillery and rocket fire, the heaviest concentration on the Western Front since 1940, descends upon the American positions. Communication lines vaporize, command posts are obliterated, and men are torn apart in their sleeping bags. Then, from the mist and smoke, emerge the shadows: King Tiger tanks, Jagdpanther tank destroyers, and infantry in snow camouflage. The Ghost Front has vanished, replaced by a rolling tidal wave of men and metal. This is the opening act of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in the West, a 6-week struggle that will transform the serene, snowy Ardennes into a frozen hell and test the limits of human endurance during a season meant for peace. To comprehend the sheer audacity of this attack, one must understand the strategic delirium from which it was born in the closing months of 1944. By late autumn, the situation for Nazi Germany in the global conflict of WWII was terminal. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut was massing for its final push into the Reich. In the west, after the heady advances following the Normandy breakout, the Allied juggernaut had stalled at the German border, but only to regroup and resupply. The Ruhr was under threat. The Siegfried Line was cracking. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters, a physically deteriorating and strategically unmoored Hitler refused the logic of defense. Instead, he envisioned a spectacular, history-repeating strike. He would mimic the triumph of 1940, slicing through these same impenetrable Ardennes forests to achieve a decisive, war-altering victory. His plan demanded impossible things: absolute secrecy, perpetually bad weather to ground Allied aircraft, lightning-fast capture of Allied fuel depots, and the complete paralysis of the American command. To fuel this fantasy, he stripped the Eastern Front and Germany's final reserves, assembling a force of over 200,000 men, including the elite, fanatical divisions of the Waffen-SS. They were told this was the decisive blow that would turn the tide of the entire war. For the unsuspecting Americans of the WWII Corps holding this quiet sector, the weary 28th Division, the green 99th and 106th, and the combat-depleted 4th, the morning of December 16th was not the beginning of a battle, but a descent into a chaotic, violent nightmare that defied all their understanding of how the final stages of WWII were meant to unfold. The initial hours were a blur of terror, heroic stands, and tragic confusion. Isolated platoons and companies, shattered by the opening barrage and cut off from command, fought and died in place. At the tiny Belgian crossroads of Lanzerath, an 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon held up the entire spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division for a critical day, a delay that would ripple through the entire German timetable. In the Schnee-Eifel region, 2 regiments of the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division, adhering to outdated static defense doctrines, were swiftly encircled and forced to surrender in one of the largest mass capitulations in American military history during WWII. Yet, amidst the disaster, the first seeds of German failure were sown. The narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes, unsuitable for a rapid mechanized advance, became choked with monumental traffic jams. The lead elements, particularly the 6th Panzer Army under the ruthless SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, became entangled in a series of bitter small-unit actions. Crucially, the northern shoulder of the offensive, anchored on the vital high ground of Elsenborn Ridge, held firm. Dogged resistance from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions denied the Germans the key road network they desperately needed, bending but not breaking. This failure to achieve a clean, immediate rupture meant the offensive began to lose its vital momentum almost from birth. Yet to the south, the 5th Panzer Army, under the more tactically adept General Hasso von Manteuffel, made alarming progress, exploiting weaker defenses and pushing toward a critical road nexus, the humble Belgian market town of Bastogne. December 17–18, 1944, the roads west, the Ardennes. Chaos reigns on the icy tracks and forest trails. A tide of American re-echelon troops, support personnel, and shattered combat units flows west in a desperate retreat, mingling with pockets of men standing firm. The German advance is spearheaded by specialized, ruthless battle groups. The most infamous is Kampfgruppe Paper, led by the fanatical SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper. His mission is to race to the Meuse River bridges at any cost, and his column of Panther tanks and armored half-tracks leaves a trail of horror in its wake. On December 17th, near the Borgnes crossroads outside Malmedy, Paper's men capture approximately 150 American soldiers from a field artillery observation battalion. The prisoners are disarmed and herded into a snow-covered field. Without warning, SS troopers open fire with machine guns and pistols. Those who survive the initial volley are hunted down and shot in the head as they feign death. 84 men are massacred. News of the Malmedy massacre, along with other atrocities against prisoners and Belgian civilians, spreads like a shockwave through American ranks. An order, grim and unofficial, passes from man to man: take no SS prisoners. The battle, already brutal, acquires a new layer of bitter, personal hatred. This barbarity, set against the backdrop of a coming Christmas, creates a profound moral dissonance that will forever define the character of the Bulge. The rules of engagement in this phase of WWII, in this frozen forest, have been stripped away. December 1920, 1944, the approaches to Bastogne. All German roads in the central Ardennes seem to lead to Bastogne, a town of little intrinsic beauty but immense tactical value, sitting at the convergence of 7 paved roads. Whichever army controls Bastogne controls the flow of men and materiel across this roadless wilderness. The German High Command knows this. Their orders are to bypass it if possible, take it if necessary. For the Americans, it must be held to strangle the German spearheads. Into this town, on December 19th, race the exhausted but elite men of the 101st Airborne Division. They are not alone. A chaotic amalgamation of tankers, tank destroyer crews, engineers and stragglers from broken units join them, forming a defensive perimeter under the acting command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. They have almost no winter gear, limited ammunition, and scant medical supplies. Before they can fully organize, the German Noose, primarily the veteran Panzer Lehr and 2nd Panzer Divisions, tightens. By December 20th, Bastogne is completely surrounded. The 101st Airborne and its attached troops, about 11,000 men, are cut off. The weather remains relentlessly overcast and frigid, preventing any hope of aerial resupply or close air support. Inside the perimeter, a grim, determined routine sets in. Foxholes are dug into the iron-hard earth. Tanks are emplaced as makeshift pillboxes at key intersections. Aid stations overflow in cold, dark cellars. The cold is an omnipresent enemy, causing crippling trench foot and frostbite, freezing weapons solid, turning plasma into useless blocks of ice. The men are on short rations, but their morale is paradoxically hardening. They are the battered bastards of Bastogne, and they know the entire world is watching. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers under flag of truce approached the American lines with a typed surrender demand from General von Leutwitz. It speaks of the hopeless situation of your troops and offers honorable surrender to avoid annihilation. The note is delivered to McAuliffe. His initial exasperated response, or nuts, becomes history when his staff, needing a formal reply, types up that single defiant word, nuts. Delivered to the confused German envoys, the reply instantly becomes a legendary symbol of American resilience, a moment of sheer psychological defiance that would echo through the remainder of WWII. December 23-24, 1944. The siege tightens, the sky clears. The German response to nuts is a furious escalation. Determined assaults from all sides test the perimeter. The fighting is desperate, often hand-to-hand in the outlying villages like Marvi. American artillery, rationing shells with miserly care, breaks up attacks with precise, devastating fire. Paratroopers, armed with bazookas and homemade sticky bombs, stalk German tanks through the rubble. The line bends, but it does not break. Then, on the afternoon of December 23rd, a meteorological miracle occurs for the besieged Americans. The weather breaks. The oppressive low cloud cover that had been the Germans' greatest ally for a week suddenly parts, revealing a crisp, cold, cerulean sky. The sound that follows is not of guns, but of aircraft engines, hundreds of them. For the first time since the offensive began, the supreme Allied weapon, air power, is unleashed. C-47 Dakotas, flying through intense flak, begin parachuting vital supplies into the shrinking perimeter. Ammunition, morphine, plasma, and finally, white winter camouflage suits. Simultaneously, squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs scream down, hunting German armor and supply columns stuck on the exposed roads. The tide of the larger battle of the Bulge turns with that clearing sky. The German advance, dependent on cloaking weather, is now exposed and vulnerable. However, for the infantryman in his foxhole, whether American or German, the clear sky also means a new kind of terror, constant, terrifying vigilance from above and unrelenting cold from below. Christmas Eve 1944 is not silent nor holy. It is illuminated by the flashes of artillery and the glow of burning vehicles. December 25, 1944, Christmas Day in Hell. There is no truce in the Ardennes, no singing of Still Nacht between the lines as in the Great War. Christmas Day 1944 is a day of relentless, decisive combat. In Bastogne, the Germans mount one of their strongest coordinated attacks, attempting a final, pre-dawn push to crush the perimeter. It is repulsed by a combination of stubborn paratrooper defense and brutal, effective artillery fire. But the most significant action occurs to the northwest, near the villages of Selles and Foy-Notre-Dame. Here, the spearhead of the 2nd Panzer Division, having bypassed Bastogne, has reached its absolute limit of advance. Its fingertips are just 4 miles from the dream objective of the Meuse River, but the spearhead is exhausted, out of fuel, and desperately exposed. On Christmas Day, the British 29th Armored Brigade and the American 2nd Armored Division, part of the Allied countermoves finally coming into play, launch a devastating attack. In what becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge's Bulge, the German column is annihilated. Over 80 tanks and hundreds of vehicles are destroyed or captured. The farthest western penetration of Hitler's offensive is chopped off. The dream of reaching Antwerp dies in the snowy fields around Selles on Christmas Day. For the common soldier, however, the day is marked by smaller, more personal tragedies and tiny acts of mercy. A shared cigarette, an attempt to heat a tin of rations over precious flame, a chaplain holding a fleeting service in a barn, the hollow ache of missing home on this most familial of days amidst the cacophony of a world at war. The strategic picture of WWII in the West had now irrevocably shifted. The German offensive, having failed to achieve a rapid breakthrough, was now a bloated salient, a bulge, stuck in difficult terrain, with overextended supply lines being pummeled from the air. The Allies, recovering from the initial shock, were now coordinating a crushing response. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made 2 critical decisions early on. He placed the resilient Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in command of the northern sector to stabilize the line, and he unleashed his most aggressive army commander, General George S. Patton, to strike from the south. Patton's Third Army had been preparing for an offensive into the Saar. In a breathtaking feat of logistical flexibility, Patton redirected his entire force, over 250,000 men, 90 degrees to the north. Promising to relieve Bastogne in a matter of days, it was a boast, but one he was determined to make good on. The race was on. December 26, 1944, 4:45 p.m., the corridor to Bastogne. After a brutal, grinding push against fierce German resistance, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, finally break through to Bastogne from the south. Tanks of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, 37th Tank Battalion make contact with the defenders of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The siege is technically relieved, though the fighting to widen the fragile corridor and fully secure the town will rage for days more. The psychological impact, however, is immediate and immense. The symbol of American resistance has held. The German gamble is visibly failing. Patton, ever theatrical, writes in his diary that he had hoped to deliver Bastogne as a Christmas present, lamenting he was a day late. The relief is not the end of the battle, but the definitive turn. The initiative now firmly belongs to the Allies. The final phase of the Battle of the Bulge, from late December 1944 through the end of January 1945, is often overlooked, but was arguably the most grueling. It was not a German rout, but a slow, bloody, grinding Allied counter-offensive to eliminate the Bulge and return to the original lines. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, though exhausted and strategically defeated, fought with a desperate, skillful ferocity, conducting phased withdrawals and imposing heavy casualties. The weather closed in again, bringing fresh snow and biting cold. The fighting for towns like Saint-Vith, Houffalize, and the deadly forest pockets around the Bois-Jacques was as brutal as anything in the offensive's early days. The landscape itself was a nightmarish testament to the violence. Forests of shattered, skeletal trees nicknamed German Warsaw by GIS, fields littered with frozen, blackened corpses, and the pervasive, sweet sickly smell of death and diesel. The Battle of the Bulge became a war of attrition that the Germans could not possibly win. They had expended the last of their operational reserves, their best remaining troops, their last stocks of armor and fuel in a futile gesture. Their losses were catastrophic, approximately 100,000 casualties, with vast amounts of irreplaceable equipment destroyed. The Luftwaffe, committed in a final, desperate effort, was virtually annihilated. The offensive delayed the Allied invasion of Germany by perhaps 6 weeks, but at a cost that guaranteed the defense of the Reich would be hollow and ultimately futile. For the Americans, the cost was also staggering. With nearly 90,000 casualties, including approximately 19,000 killed, it was the bloodiest single battle the United States fought during all of WWII. The human stories within those numbers are infinite. The terror of a king tiger emerging from the mist, the numbing agony of frostbitten feet, the surreal kindness of a Belgian family sharing their last potatoes with retreating soldiers, the silence of a snow-covered forest after an artillery barrage, the enduring grief for a friend lost on Christmas Eve. The battle forged a deep, unshakable bond between those who endured it and instilled a profound respect for the enemy's fighting prowess, even in defeat. It also showcased the remarkable resilience and adaptability of the American citizen soldier. Thrown into chaos, cold, and terror, the GI had met the last, furious onslaught of the Wehrmacht and had not broken. He had bent, retreated in confusion, been surrounded, but he had held where it mattered most, at Elsenborn, at Saint-Vith, and most iconically at Bastogne. January 25, 1945, the original front lines. The lines have, more or less, returned to where they were on December 15th. The Bulge has been flattened. The cost is etched into the frozen ground and into the faces of the survivors. The Battle of the Bulge was the culminating, definitive proof that Nazi Germany had lost the military initiative for good in WWII. It was a desperate, strategic asterisk Gotterdammerung that consumed the last strength of the German army in the West. For the Allies, it was a brutal, near-fatal lesson in overconfidence. a reminder that a wounded enemy is at its most dangerous. It also solidified the special relationship between American and British forces, despite tense command disputes, and demonstrated the awesome, industrial-scale logistical might that underpinned the Allied war effort. The ability to redirect entire armies, to supply a besieged town by air, and to absorb horrific losses while continuing to fight. The legacy of the Bulge is complex. It stands as a stark, wintry monument to the chaos, chance, and cost of war. It is a story of grand strategy gone awry and of small unit heroism that saved the day. It is a tale of atrocious war crimes and breathtaking humanity, all set against the poignant backdrop of the Christmas season. The frozen hell of the Ardennes in December 1944 was the last great convulsion of the Nazi war machine in the West, a gamble played out in snow and blood that ultimately hastened the fiery end of the Third Reich. When the snows finally melted in the spring of 1945, they revealed not just the scars on the land, but the unmistakable path forward, a path that led directly across the Rhine River and into the heart of a dying Germany, bringing the European chapter of the Second World War to its final, definitive conclusion. The men who fought there, on both sides, would carry the memory of that frozen Christmas in the Ardennes for the rest of their lives, a memory of a time when the fate of a world at war hung in the balance amidst the silent, falling snow. The human dimension, a microscopic view of the frozen. To truly grasp the Battle of the Bulge, one must move beyond the arrows on maps and the grand operational moves and descend into the foxholes, the frozen forests, and the shattered villages where the war was lived and died. This was a battle defined by its environment as much as by its enemies. The cold of the Ardennes winter of 1944-45 was not merely uncomfortable. It was a tactical factor, a relentless, degenerative force that crippled men and machines alike. Temperatures routinely plunged below 0 Fahrenheit. For the American soldier, initially equipped with standard-issue field jackets and leather boots, this was a death sentence. Trench foot, a crippling condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and cold, reached epidemic proportions. Men's feet would swell, blister, turn black, and rot within their boots. The agony was such that soldiers would rather face enemy fire than endure another night of immobility in a waterlogged hole. Weapons became untrustworthy. Rifles and machine guns would freeze shut. Firing pins would become brittle and snap. Men urinated on their bolts to thaw them, a temporary, desperate fix. Mortar baseplates would sink unevenly into the frozen muck. Throwing off aim, tank engines had to be kept running constantly, guzzling precious fuel lest their lubricants solidify into gelid blocks. The cold also had a profound psychological effect, a creeping numbness that invaded the mind as well as the body, sapping the will to fight, to move, even to care. Yet within this frigid crucible, the human spirit displayed astonishing ingenuity and camaraderie. Soldiers became experts in fieldcraft born of necessity. They learned to line their foxholes with straw scavenged from barns or pine boughs cut from the forest, creating a thin, vital barrier against the frozen earth. They built small, clandestine fires in deep pits to avoid giving away their position, huddling around the meager warmth for precious minutes. The sharing of resources became a sacrament. A single dry sock, a candle, a can of heated stew became treasures to be divided. Medics performed miracles of improvisation, using shelter halves as stretchers, sterilizing instruments in schnapps, and keeping plasma from freezing by storing it under their own shirts against their skin. The bond between soldiers transcended the immediate horror. It was a mutual pact for survival in the face of an indifferent, frozen universe. This was the intimate, personal reality of WWII during the Bulge, a war not just against the Germans, but against the elemental physics of winter itself. The German soldiers' experience, the other side of the hill asterisk. While the American narrative dominates our memory of the Bulge, the German infantrymen and panzer crewmen endured the same horrific conditions, often with even fewer resources. The initial surge of the offensive was fueled by a potent mix of elite fanaticism and the veteran skill of units like the Asterisk Leibstandarte and Panzer Lehr. But this masked deeper weaknesses. Many of the infantry divisions thrown into the attack were Asterisk Volksgrenadier Asterisk units, hastily assembled from conscripted older men, boys from the Hitler Youth, and sailors and airmen with no ground combat training. Their morale was a volatile compound of last-ditch patriotism, fear of the advancing Soviets, and Nazi ideological indoctrination. They attacked in the dead of winter wearing thin camouflage smocks over their uniforms, their leather boots equally unsuitable for the cold. Their supply situation was catastrophic from the start. The entire operational plan relied on capturing American fuel dumps. When those were not taken intact or were destroyed by retreating GIS, the German spearheads simply ground to a halt. Panther and King Tiger tanks, mechanical marvels but fuel-hungry beasts, became immobile steel coffins, abandoned by the roadside. The Luftwaffe's promised support evaporated in the face of overwhelming Allied air power once the weather cleared. For the German soldier, the Bulge quickly transformed from a war-winning offensive into a desperate, frozen retreat. They too suffered from frostbite and trench foot. They too scavenged for food, resorting to slaughtering local livestock or ransacking abandoned American K-ration packs. And they fought with the desperate knowledge that this was the last throw of the dice for their nation. The fear of capture was tinged with the dread of what their SS comrades had wrought at Malmedy. They knew reprisals were likely. Their experience was one of fleeting, costly success, followed by prolonged, agonizing defeat, all endured in a landscape that seemed as hostile as the enemy. Logistics, the invisible battlefield. The Battle of the Bulge was ultimately decided not just by the soldiers at the front, but by the vast, mostly unseen machinery of logistics. This was the invisible battlefield of WWII, and here the Allied advantage was overwhelming and ultimately decisive. The German offensive was a logistical fantasy. It required moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles into position in absolute secrecy, a feat they remarkably achieved. But sustaining that force in the field was another matter. German industry was crippled by bombing, fuel production was a fraction of need, and the rail network was in shambles. The plan's reliance on captured American gasoline was a testament to this desperation. When the spearheads outran their horse-drawn supply columns and failed to capture the needed dumps, the offensive seized up. In stark contrast, the Allied logistical response was a masterpiece of modern warfare. The infamous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that had supplied the Normandy breakout, now shifted to meet the crisis. Thousands of trucks, driven around the clock by a racially segregated force of mostly black American soldiers, poured men and materiel into the Ardennes. The flexibility of the Allied command structure allowed for the astonishing redirection of Patton's Third Army. But perhaps the most iconic logistical feat was the aerial resupply of Bastogne. On December 23rd alone, over 240 C-47s dropped 144 tons of supplies into the besieged perimeter. This was not a flawless operation. Parachutes drifted into German lines, medical supplies were broken on impact, but it sustained the defenders at their most critical hour. This contrast in logistical capability, the German army literally running on fumes versus the Allies' seemingly bottomless well of resources, highlighted a fundamental truth of the later stages of WWII. Industrial and organizational capacity had become the primary determinants of victory. Command and controversy, Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Patton. The crisis of the Bulge ignited one of the most famous command controversies of the entire Second World War, a clash of egos and national pride that played out at the highest levels. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower's calm handling of the initial crisis was exemplary. He quickly identified the attack as a major offensive, not a local diversion, and began funneling reserves to the shoulders of the Bulge. His decision to give Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery temporary command of all forces north of the Bulge was logical, as the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies in that sector were cut off from General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters to the south. Montgomery, ever the precise, cautious commander, proceeded to methodically tidy up the northern flank, but his manner infuriated the Americans. He held press conferences where he appeared to claim he had saved the Americans from disaster, fostering a narrative of British competence rescuing bungling Yanks. This perception, whether fair or not, caused deep and lasting resentment. On the southern flank, General George S. Patton delivered on his boast, pivoting the Third Army with breathtaking speed. His drive to relieve Bastogne was a classic display of aggressive willpower, though it was also costly in men and machines. The tension between Montgomery's caution and Patton's aggression, mediated by Eisenhower's diplomacy, defined the Allied response. This command drama underscored the fragile nature of the coalition fighting the final stages of WWII, a partnership that could weather military catastrophe but was perpetually strained by national pride and personal vanity. Aftermath and the road to the Rhine ***. By the end of January 1945, the front lines were restored. The battlefield was a grotesque monument to the violence. Entire forests sheared off at chest height by artillery, villages reduced to smoldering piles of brick, and the ground so littered with unexploded ordnance, spent casings, and human remains that it seemed to have been churned by a malevolent plow. For the Allies, the victory was Pyrrhic but decisive. The U.S. Army had been bloodied but had proven its mettle in a defensive battle against the best Germany could muster. The German army in the West, however, was ruined. Its losses in men and equipment were irreplaceable. The elite panzer divisions were hollow shells. The strategic reserve was gone. The failure of the Bulge offensive meant that the defense of the Rhine and of Germany itself would be conducted by a skeleton force, bolstered by old men and boys of the Volkssturm***, lacking fuel, air cover, and hope. When the Allies launched their final assaults across the Rhine in March 1945, they faced an enemy already broken in the snows of the Ardennes. The path to victory in the European theater of WWII was cleared not in the spring flowers along the river, but in the frozen hell of that previous Christmas. The men who survived the Bulge carried its lessons of cold, of courage, of chaos with them as they crossed into Germany, bringing an end to the nightmare of the Third Reich, a nightmare that had made its last, furious stand amidst the silent, falling snow of a Christmas they would never forget.